nothing really ever ends, except maybe Colonel Trautman randomly, unless you read the IMDb trivia on the franchise. This is my review for the Rambo 5 film franchise.
It's Headphones Neil!
What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Headphones Neil Reviews. I'm your host, as always, Headphones Neil. So, for this particularly exciting episode of the show, I finally got through all 5 films in the Rambo franchise. So, I thought I would, number one, watch the films because at the very least, I don't think I've seen all of the films in their entirety, and 2, I wanted to just watch the films in order to see how they hold up as far as individual stories, story arcs throughout the series, if there was one, and generally just see how the films are. So, overall, I want to say that for me, the films were generally pretty good. But I found in watching them that the even number films were actually, for some reason, felt like they were better versions of the odd number films. So you have Rambo First Blood, which was a good introduction to the Rambo character. You see that he's still dealing with the PTSD of the Vietnam War. He's Green Beret, or the best Green Beret, the ultimate killing machine. But in dealing with his PTSD, he wants to just be left alone. He doesn't want anyone to bother him, and he won't bother anybody else. And we see that culminate in the end of the film with his discussion with Colonel Trautman. And he does understand, or Rambo does understand, what he did with the killing, and he faces the consequences of his actions, but ultimately, he just wants to lead a peaceful life and get over the horrors that he saw in the war and that he's had to do in the war because he was trained to do that. So, from there, when we lead into First Blood Part 2, we essentially get a very similar kind of film where he's pulled into a situation where he has to do a lot of killing. He's double-crossed by Kreese and the other guy who's trying to do the cleanup in the film in Vietnam. So this film is probably the most notable of the franchise because of 3 items. The first is that we get the look that we know of Rambo in just the pants with the bandana around his forehead, or around his head, and then with the bow and arrow and a gun, and numerous shots of a gun. I don't know the specific model number of the gun, so I'm going to admit that I don't know that, but this is where we essentially get the look of John Rambo, and it's not a look that I did not notice until we got to Rambo 4, when he's saving when he has to go back to try and save the mercenaries from the jungles in, I think it was Thailand. So, but don't quote me on that. But essentially, Rambo First Blood Part 2 is where we get the initial version of the look, and then in Rambo 4, or just Rambo, is where we get the mature or more finalized look of the character. But if you have an image of that, if you have that image of Rambo, it's not until the second film that we get that known image. The first one is like I said, it's a introduction of the character, his backstory, his abilities. We're kind of the audience is kind of taking the perspective of those police officers from the small town that we don't know who this guy is. We're kind of not necessarily suspicious, but we're trying to kind of figure out who this John Rambo character is. And I want to say like halfway through, or essentially once Rambo escapes from that jail, is kind of where we split ways with those police officers, and we start to empathize with the Rambo character, that essentially if the police officers had just left him alone, everything would have been okay. But basically, to round out the first 2 films, Rambo First Blood Part 2 essentially presents a clear picture of the Rambo character in that we have the various characters, or we have essentially the bad guys, or we have Rambo being pulled into a situation that's not of his doing, but because Colonel Trautman is asking something of him, his former leader from the Vietnam War, Rambo is willing to, or more willing to help out, but then because of outside circumstances, he's pulled into being that person he was in that war, even though he does not want to be that person. And that's kind of essentially where all the various situations in the film come into play. So basically, for example, with the first two films, Rambo 2 is the better film, in my opinion. And also to round out my thought for why the film is notable is that we have the actor who plays John Kreese from the Karate Kid films and Cobra Kai stars as kind of this. I want to say he's not necessarily the main villain, but he's like the henchman to the bad guy of the film who causes the double cross to Rambo, but becomes the face of the villainy because he's probably the only guy who could really has a chance to go up against Rambo. But essentially, this is the connection between Rambo and Karate Kid and Cobra Kai, and more towards Cobra Kai because if you've watched those seasons, you know that John Kreese was in the Vietnam War, and that's where he got his karate training. So this kind of ties that all together. In that Kreese was in the Vietnam War, the actor who played him was in Rambo 2, and is also in Vietnam, so it gives him a reason to be there. And if you look at the years of films were released, notably Rambo 2 and the first two karate films, they were all in the early 80s. So it kind of gives an in-universe reason for Kreese to be in Vietnam, and then also for his character in Rambo to be in Vietnam. So kind of those random degrees of separation to bring that actor in to pull those two film franchises in together. The final piece of fun little awesomeness of the film is that when Rambo is talking to his guide in the film, when they're going initially I think when they're going in the boat up the river, and at some point later, Rambo admits that he's expendable, and then the lady says that he's not expendable because people count on him to get the job done when nobody else can, essentially. But we get a reference to me, which I don't think was on purpose, but maybe as far as the Expendables films go, this was probably that weird tie-in, which might be a random trivia, but I just found it particularly cool that in the middle of the Rambo franchise, we get a shout out to another film franchise starring Sylvester Stallone called The Expendables, and in The Expendables, his rise is one of the film's franchises that he's notable for is the Rambo franchise. So just a little bit of fun there, which kind of took me a little bit out of the film and makes me want to rewatch the Expendables, because now that I've heard that, I want to see if there's maybe a callback to Vietnam in one of those films by Sylvester Stallone or maybe one of the other guys. I have seen the first. Actually, I think I've seen all three of the films, but it's been some time, so I don't remember offhand if there was anything like that, and I wasn't paying attention to it at the time. But I just found it particularly intriguing that they made that in-universe connection. Beyond that, the rest of the films, in my opinion, were okay. Rambo 3 and 4 kind of followed a similar plan as 1 and 2, where Rambo 4 was... Rambo 3 and 4, I guess, were kind of similar enough, where Rambo has to go in Rambo 3, John Rambo has to go into a village in Afghanistan to save the village there from a Russian warlord who's essentially taking over the area. The only reason that he goes there is because Colonel Trautman has been captured, and because of that connection, Rambo has a reason to go. In Rambo 4, he is the only reason he goes to save the Christian missionaries is because he dropped them off in that village, and I guess the priest of their local parish, I guess, or local branch of their whatever missionary group they're a part of, comes to talk to him, and because Rambo was the last person to see them, the priest kind of becomes his conscience to go in and save them. So if that feels kind of weird as far as why Rambo would go in and do that, in reading the trivia, apparently the actor who played Colonel Trautman passed away between Rambo's 3 and 4, so that's the reason we don't see him in the rest of the franchise. So for me, that was actually kind of a bummer, because when you get into Rambo 4, having had Rambo and Trautman in the prior films, you wonder why or when Trautman is going to show up, and if you don't know the history, then it's kind of weird that he's all of a sudden not there. I mean, granted, the actors can make the choice not to be in any more films, but because he's in the prior 3, you kind of expect it. And so it becomes a bummer and sadness that you no longer have Rambo's conscience for doing the right thing, the reason Rambo is a killing machine, the reason why he has to really get himself involved in any of these situations. So granted, there's probably a reason at the time why they didn't mention anything in the film, most likely out of respect to the actor, or maybe it was too close to the film, so they didn't want to do that. Of course nobody wants to bring up something like that when you get close to somebody, but for me, I got to thinking that if they did do something in the film, how would they bring it up? And the best, most respectful way I thought of was to start off the film with the funeral of Trautman and have Rambo pay his respects, and then that's the reason why he's in the jungles that he's in, or basically make that the reason why Rambo is in the place he's at, where the missionaries go to hire him, is because now that Trautman is no longer there to be his conscience, he no longer wants to be in any place that reminds him of his mentor and leader, so he goes and shuts himself off again from the world, like we see it in Rambo 3, which is kind of why I say that Rambo 3 and 4 are similar. But for me, it would have been nice to have something at the beginning of Rambo 4 to bring up why Trautman's no longer there. Just basically something out of respect, because the character, to me, felt like an integral part of the first 3 films. So, and that would have been a good premise for Rambo 4 as to why Rambo does not want to help the missionaries, and why he does not want to get into that life, and why he's consistently warning the missionaries that they don't want to go into the part of the region that they want to go into, and then why he ultimately does decide to go save them, because he's the only one that can, and Trautman would have been the kind of person to tell Rambo that he has to go do that. And he's, like I said, he's the only person who could do that. So that brings us to Rambo Last Blood, where we essentially get Rambo returning back to the States, back to his ranch, or I think at the end of Rambo 4 is where we have Rambo returning to his ranch in Arizona, and in Last Blood is where we see that he's been living the good life. A former, I guess, I don't want to say maid, but whoever helped raise him back when he was a kid is now living with him with her daughter, maybe granddaughter, who's getting ready to head to college. So Rambo is now able to finally lead the peaceful life, but he wants to, or she wants to, find out who her father is, and against the wishes of Rambo and her grandmother, the mother figure in her life, she goes to Mexico to find her dad and ends up getting kidnapped. Rambo ultimately goes to find out who kidnapped her, gets beat up, recovers, and ultimately finds where she is and saves her, but ends up dying because she was basically sent into slavery to become a prostitute. So for me, those scenes were particularly hard to watch. They made it particularly gruesome, which was really hard. It was hard to watch and particularly heartbreaking. So you really got the feel of how hard it was on Rambo's character. So he ultimately he leads them back to his ranch, and uses the ranch and the tunnels that he's been digging to take them all out. So basically it gives him the advantage of one guy over, I think it was I want to say around 10 to 15 guys. So because he's older, I guess he sets it up in a way that he's able to take them all out, accounting for his age. But because of his years of experience and training, he's able to take them all out. And because he promises to rip out the guy's heart to share how Rambo felt, he does, by the end of the film, cut out the guy's heart. So that was also particularly gruesome. So another hard scene to watch just because of the gruesomeness. So you get to see Rambo get his revenge on the guy. Ultimately, Rambo Last Blood felt like they were setting it up to be the last film in the franchise. So you get Rambo's understanding that there's never going to be any peace for a guy like him. So rather than fighting it, he's going to lead the peaceful life. And as things come up, he's going to deal with them. So essentially, the Rambo Last Blood felt more like a retirement movie for the character and the franchise rather than a full-on Rambo film. So overall, I do want to say it was good, but you can see how there were fewer of the elements that made the previous Rambo films good. But they did bring in some of the essential elements, like Rambo is living a peaceful life, something bad happens, so he's called back into action. And by the end of the film, he comes out victorious because he did some things he didn't want to do, and he's ultimately left alone again. So that's kind of why I felt like the final film in the franchise. But considering that the even number, or going back to what I said at the beginning of the review, that the even number of films ended up being the better version of the odd number of films that preceded them, it feels like they could pull out one more Rambo, even call it Rambo Final Blood, like they like to do with, and I hate making this comparison, but with the Final Destination movies, I think it was, where they have Final Destination 1, then 2, then The Final Destination, or The Ultimate Final Destination, something like that, where they have all those crazy add-on names to Final Destination, where really it can only really happen once or twice. So they could really pull out one more film, call it Rambo Final Blood, and even make it the literal on-screen death of the character, where he's finally pulled into a situation that not necessarily that he can't handle, because we wouldn't want to see a situation that Rambo can't handle, but ultimately it does him in because of his age, or because of whatever extenuating circumstances that he can't handle, or ultimately he finds peace, or he's finally pulled into a desk job with the army, or they finally discharge him, or they honorably discharge him. So I don't know, for whatever reason, they can come up with a plot and even make it a similar thing like Rambo's 3 and 4, where they remake Last Blood, but make it in a way where it means that we're definitely not gonna see any more films, but it does become, or Final Blood, for example, would become the better version of Last Blood, even though they're essentially the same films, but a final, more perfect version of Last Blood. So overall, I do want to say, in general, I want to say that the films were pretty good. They all get a grade of about I want to say like about a B plus to A minus. The even number of films, I give a grade of about a B. to B+. The even number films I give a grade of about an A- to an A. But if I was to pick my favorite of the films, I probably want to give it to Rambo First Blood Part 2. Just because we get to see more of the character, we see him return to Vietnam. We of course have Colonel Trautman. We have the connections that I mentioned with Cobra Kai and the Expendables. The look that we know of him, his throwing abilities with the knife and the gun, and turning the situation around to his advantage. But overall, the franchise is good. I like the general progression of it. At the very base of it, each movie is essentially another situation in which Rambo gets pulled back into action against his will. But they are films of Rambo wanting to escape the horrors of the Vietnam War and find or live a life of peace where no one bothers him and he bothers nobody. So, in general, very good films. Acting gets better over time, and notably, Stallone's accent becomes easier to understand over time. You definitely notice that over the course of the film. So the first one is the hardest to understand, and it slowly gets better over time. In the first film, he doesn't speak a whole lot, I think, just to account for his accent. But over the course of the films, it does become easier to understand as you get used to his accent, or I don't know if he's speaking a little bit more clearly, or they work around it so that it's easier to understand. But that's the side thing that I noticed in watching these films back to back. But I will say that now, having seen them, I can knock these films off of my bucket list, that I've now seen the Rambo films. I can definitely see how it catapulted Stallone into stardom between the Rocky films and the Rambo films. So if you haven't seen them, I definitely do recommend watching them. If you're going to watch any one film in the franchise, I say, like I keep saying, going back to Rambo First Blood Part 2, you get enough of his backstory in First Blood Part 2 that you don't necessarily need to watch the first one, but watching the first one sets up the beginning of the second film as to why Rambo's in jail and why Trautman pulls him out of jail. So for that, you can give up an hour and a half or so for the first film. So if anything, maybe watch the first two. The rest of them are okay, or you can skip directly to the last film. 3 and 4 are okay enough to watch as films, but it goes back to they're just Rambo in another situation that he's pulled into against as well. So that's all there is for this particular review. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, or anything like that, you can find me on Twitter at PatelN01. The website is pateln01.com for past episodes, subscription links, supporting the show, and all of that good stuff. And of course, as a patron, you get early access to upcoming content, bonus content reviews for episodes shortly after they're released. So just like some of the recent episodes I've reviewed, or episodes that have come out, I'll have a bonus content review for patrons out after this one. So for extra content, definitely support the show, or support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/PatelN01. But that's all there is for this particular review. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time.